is an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Grace of Kings, chapters 17, 18, and 19, brought to you by Kyle. In these chapters, the Duke of Zudi decides to cement his position in order to get some troops to take back what was very unexpectedly wrenched away from him while he was on a picnic. Did not see that coming. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. This was a bit of a surprise. I should have seen this coming because everything in the nation, I don't know if I want to call it nation, everything in this land is really, really unstable right now. So things, going up in smoke and changing hands and whatever, I should expect that a little bit more than I do. But I always imagine that it takes more than it does to completely overthrow things when they're already this unstable. So I always figure that it would take more organization or more time or whatever. And it doesn't really. If shit is kind of tenuous to begin with, you can just sort of poke at it and it falls apart. So yeah, chapter 17, The Gates of Zudi. Tano Naman's surprise attack on Dimu marked the beginning of a grand imperial sweep along the southern shore of the Liru River. Within weeks, most of the towns and cities that had surrendered to the Krima-Shigin Expeditionary Force, I really didn't know that that's what it was called, but that's hilarious, were back under imperial control, and the imperial army began an inexorable march south for the reconquest of Kakru. So shit's getting serious. And what I was kind of waiting for, which doesn't wind up coming, and I'm glad of it, don't get me wrong, was that I thought that, that his forces, and by his, I mean, Naman, I thought that he might punish any towns that had surrendered to the Krima-Shigin Expeditionary Force. But we don't really read that. So I'm going to try and take some comfort in it and assume, without much justification, that they were sort of forgiven and let live. I'm not sure how true that is, but we shall see. Meanwhile, King Thufi, reminder for anybody who is trying to keep track of this and does not remember, King Thufi is the king of Kakru who let Huno have his king of West Kakru title, kind of not even out of the goodness of his heart, more out of I do kind of owe him. He's the one who started this entire rebellion. I would not be King Thufi right now if it weren't for him. And we all just kind of make up the titles anyway, so why doesn't he get to say that he's king of West Kakru? Frankly, I should be glad that he's not taking all of Kakru back. So he feels that he owes Huno a lot, and I was really surprised at how much of that feeling of debt he retained even after everything went so wrong with Huno. I'm not entirely sure if Thufi has heard all the things that Huno had been doing. Because there's a vibe to it of him being irritated later on with some of the ways that the other ministers are talking about Huno, and he feels like they're being disrespectful. And I'm just dude, they should be disrespectful. The guy was a fucking madman. But Thufi doesn't seem to see it that way. And yet, Thufi does seem to be someone who has some common sense. So, and by common sense, I mean common in the way that it's generally meant, which is to say that he thinks the way a person of average intelligence thinks. He isn't as foolish as some. He isn't as observant as others. He's perfectly serviceable as a ruler and does what I think looks to be the most, what he thinks looks to be the most like middle of the road, action, and generally is right, like in that way. But I am surprised that he can maintain this feeling of respect for somebody who had wound up like enslaving everybody that came to enslaving, murdering, and essentially turned into the thing that he claimed to be campaigning against. I'm just, sort of worried that he doesn't either hear or believe rumors that may come to him. But that's assuming that rumors come to him at all. Excuse me. So I'm not sure. So yeah, King Thufi, we start off with everybody who is, and this I found really funny. There's a meeting and they're all honoring King Jizu, who is the one who burned himself to death. And he is really irritated. This is so funny. King Thufi glanced at the descending level in the water clock and tried to hide his impatience. It was doubtful if any of these men, including the Rima ambassador, could have picked King Jizu out of a group of beggars 3 weeks ago, but now they all acted as if they had known the man since he was a child. The Fasa ambassador gave the longest speech of all and emphasized again and again the, quote, special relationship between Fasa and Rima. King Thufi tried so hard not to give in to the temptation to roll his eyes that he found himself suffering from a headache. The Fasa ambassador finally sat down an hour later. Good God. An hour later. So Thufi is like fucking finally and starts to say some shit about the main issue, which is how to defend against Neiman, who is coming down. And he is about to say this when somebody cuts him off, the Fasa ambassador, and this is when he says, we should also mourn King Huno of West Kukru. Though his manners might have been rough, the ambassador winked at the ambassadors for Gan and Amu, who tittered. He was nonetheless honored by King Thufi and elevated into the ranks of the great Tiro states. And this is when Thufi says, you might think Huno Krima was a country bumpkin, but without him this rebellion wouldn't even have started. The least you could do is honor the man's memory with some sincerity. Which, I have to say, as much as I'm like, I can't believe that he doesn't see Huno Krima to be the friggin' batshit crazy despot that he wound up being, these guys aren't like, the dudes that he's angry at aren't even mentioning that. They're more like being derisive about the guy's origins. So I guess I understand what he's really irritated by here. But yeah, I really want to know if he knows about the other shit that Huno did. That's like my main concern right now. So again, he starts to, after everybody like makes their little speeches about Huno, again, he starts to be like, all right, we have to discuss the matter of Naiman's invasion of Kukru. And then King Kosugi steps up and is like, actually, if I can say something. And fucking poor Thufi is just like, sure, go ahead. Like, so annoyed. So, though Han wasn't even free of imperial occupation, Kosugi was obsessed with preserving Han's, quote, territorial integrity. The man had one tune, and he sang it constantly. Yet he couldn't just tell Kosugi to shut up. All the Tiro states were, in theory, equals, so despite the fact that Han had contributed absolutely nothing to the rebellion so far, Thufi had to let Kosugi have his say in the Grand Council. So he's talking about how some Fasa troops are taking advantage of Naiman's focus on Kukru to occupy lands that by ancient and natural right belong to Rima and Han. And the Fasa ambassador is like, no, they're, we know that there had been some errors in the past, but I know that, like, what is it? The maps given to the Fasa commanders have been scrupulously examined to correct those old errors that might have mistakenly enlarged Han at the expense of Fasa. But you've reminded me of something else. I do need to lodge a protest with Gon. Gon's ships have been harassing Fasa fishermen. And those islands have always belonged to Fasa, not Gon. I don't think the annals of Gon agree with you, said the ambassador of Gon. Indeed, the illegal occupation of those islands by Fasa occurred only because Gon had been busy dealing with Xana more than 100 years ago. And while we are talking about correcting old errors, I think it's time for Kukru to finally do the honorable thing and return the Tunoas to Gon. So it's all this squabbling about whose land belonged to who before, and whether the person who has the land now really deserves to have it, and whether or not, like, now that things have, quote, settled down, we should start, like, organizing this shit out. And finally, Thufi has to, like, bust in there and be like, y'all are acting like everything is back to normal and that we can focus on this petty shit. We are under siege right now. They're about to come for us. And you guys are worried about your fucking little border disputes, which is not the issue that we need to be focusing on. Get your priorities straight. Holy shit, guys. You're going to be so busy looking at each other that you won't even see this motherfucker coming down the road with 20,000 men. What are you doing? And they all, like, shut up for a second after he says this, and then they begin with their fucking bickering again. And Phin, Zindu, who is off to the side listening, just leaves, and it's just like, oh, fuck these guys, which I'm sure Thufi really wishes he could do. And this is what I mean when I'm saying, like, I feel like Thufi has sense, like, you know, but if he really exercised his will in a more effective way, I think he could get all of these guys to shut the fuck up. He lets them talk too much, and I want him to bring the hammer down a little bit harder. He's trying to appease all of their egos by letting them all have a say. But there comes a point where you can't, like, you need to figure your shit out without everybody's input. 'Cause I don't know. I'm just, we'll see. All right. I'm getting distracted here. So let's talk about what happens with Kuni-Guru. Bless his sweet little heart. Kuni-Guru just wants to have a nice day with his friends and go out and have a picnic. He's been working really, really hard. And he wants to take a tiny break. So he does. This kills me. They go out and have a really nice picnic, eating with their hands. They're in the middle of, like, laying back on the hill and thinking about how nice the day has been and how good the food was and everything. And then he stands up and stretches and he notices something and is like, hey, why are they flying white flags over the city? And they all get up and see that the red flags with the black and white ravens on them that had been there have been replaced. And Kuni has to head out real fast. The gates were locked, and there is a man at the top of the walls who's yelling down, I'm sorry, Duke Guru. I'm sorry, this is so funny to me. Where's Muru? Kuni shouted. Muru was normally in charge of raising and lowering the gates. He wouldn't betray you and tried to fight, and Lieutenant Doza had to kill him. Kuni felt as if he had been punched hard in the gut. Why are you doing this? While you were out, Lieutenant Doza asked the city elders to pledge allegiance to the Emperor again. We heard the General Naaman will spare any city that ejects the rebels and surrenders right away. But if we resist, the punishment will be harsh. I really like you, Duke Guru, and I think you're a fine prince, but I have a wife and a little girl, and I want to watch her grow up and get married. For a moment, Kuni was racked by his old doubts. His face clouded over, and as his horse backed up, he almost fell off. Damn, he muttered. Damn! You started with nothing, said Gia. Why can't you start again? Ah, Gia, always there with the fucking maxims. So yeah, he yells up, it's all right. Tell everyone I understand their decision, even if I don't agree. But you haven't seen the last of Kuni-Guru. And it turns out that he is quite right. So they go off and decide to head to King Thufi. And Kuni decides that he's just going to cash in on being a duke and having that title right now and ask King Thufi if he can get some troops to get Zudi back. Which didn't even occur to me as an option because he doesn't have a territory. But as we find out later, he doesn't need to tell Thufi he doesn't have a territory anymore until later when he asks for his favor, which is really fucking smart. Kuni, what? This is the thing. Shit like this is part of why I feel like I'm not as successful as I could be. Because people talk about fake it till you make it. And I have so much anxiety that people will find out that I'm faking that I can't convincingly fake it. So riddled with self-doubt and imposter syndrome, hold back. And if you fucking just present yourself the way you need to, people don't find out until it's too late that you don't know what you're doing. And by the time they find out, maybe you do know what you're doing by then. So I really need to take a leaf out of Kuni's book here and learn how to do this a little bit more. So they're in the middle of camping on their way to King Thufi when this guy comes out of the woods. This black man with green eyes, and he is really gaunt and thin, and asks if he can share their dinner, and that he says that he has some wine that he can share in exchange. And Kuni looks at him and is like, I know you. You're the guy who rode the kite and tried to kill Mapidere. And then we go to chapter 18, which is all about that dude, whose name is Luan Zia. Luan's story is, so he comes from Han, and apparently everything in Han had been organized around education, and they had a really strong public education system that even took in the poor, and wealthier students or more talented students would go to private schools, but they still had an incredibly healthy base in education in all subjects, even for farmers and whatnot, which I just think education is the number one thing that a strong country should rely on. And our educational system here in the US is abysmal and really frankly embarrassing. And reading this description of what it used to be I was dying. Because it just sounds like a fucking utopia to me. In Old Han, a traveler could stop any farmer walking through the fields and have a conversation about politics, astronomy, agriculture, meteorology, and learn something. In Ginpen, even a common merchant's assistant clerk could calculate cube roots and fill out magic squares with no assistance. I really want to know what magic squares is. In tea houses and wine bars, though the food was plain and the drink merely passable, one could encounter the most brilliant minds of Dara debating matters of political and natural philosophy. Though Han wasn't the most industrious of the Tiro states, her engineers and inventors created the most sought-after designs for watermills and windmills that made the most accurate water clocks. But all this changed after the conquest. Compared with other Tiro states, Mapidere's book-burning and scholar-burying had dealt a harsher blow to Han's spirit. The learning huts were no longer funded and fell into disuse. Many of the private academics in Jinpen closed, and the few that survived were mere shadows of their former selves, where the scholars were afraid to give true answers and more afraid to ask real questions. Y'all, does this not sound fucking familiar to anybody? Just saying. I can't tell you enough how much this sort of thing depresses me. And it's the sort of thing, whenever I hear anybody being like, oh, you go to university and it's just a bunch of liberals, it's just hey, does it ever occur to you that places of higher education all being liberal may be because liberal thinking tends to be more based in fact? That it's not just this weird inherent slant that nobody can explain, but the fact that there is research backing up what many liberals tend to believe. And this is the sort of thing, afraid to give true answers and more afraid to ask real questions. We're reaching a point, they literally in Texas added creationism to science books. They took out Hillary running for president from history books entirely. She's not even mentioned. In Texas specifically, there is so much about our educational system just simple things as well. Like, you know, my understanding of race relations in the United States is all based in research that I have done as an adult, because none of that was taught to me in school. We're given the broad overstrokes and we're told things that are either slanted in such a way as to make it seem more kindly or well-intentioned than it was, or we're flat out lied to. And like, you know, taking Hillary out of the history books is just, that's a lie. She was there. What are you doing? And as far as like slavery, we have, there was a huge outcry recently where one of the history books, again, here in Texas, called it immigration. These people were kidnapped and forcibly brought here, but they're calling it an immigration. No. But that's the sort of shit that lays the foundation for ignorant people with false understandings of our history to then go on with that misunderstanding and establish laws, run for office and whatever, with a complete miscomprehension of what our country is about and how it's run and what other people have experienced. Because white supremacists have created a whole different history for themselves. And it's alarming. And reading this, it was just like, it just upset me so deeply. I can't even tell you. I don't think I really even like realized how much education is like a point for me until I read things like this and hear about school books being changed and things. And then I'm like, oh my God, that's where it all starts. So back to the Zias. Luan Zia is basically a fucking prodigy, right? And he is just amazing at remembering things, at reciting things, at doing math. And he even comes up with a new way. And I'm going to read this to you guys because I can't handle this. I don't even know what he's fucking talking about. So there's this thing that they do divination, and they really believe that their divination methods are sort of like lined up with mathematics and geometry. And that the gods are going to give you messages and you ask the same question multiple times and use things to get your answers that have different degrees of response. And then you calculate those degrees of response to the most common, and that's your answer. Well, what Luan decides to do, he drew a square in the sand and inscribed within it a circle. He closed his eyes and tossed pebbles in the general direction of the figure, and then marked down on a piece of paper the number of times the pebbles managed to land inside the square, and the number of times the pebbles also landed inside the circle. His father came to get him after the ceremony was over. "What game are you playing, Lutika?" Luan replied that he was not playing a game at all. He was calculating the value of Lutho's number, which is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. The circle's area, Luan explained, was Lutho's number times its radius squared. The square's area, on the other hand, was the square of twice the circle's radius, or 4 times the radius squared. So the ratio of the circle's area to the squares was equal to Lutho's number divided by 4. If enough pebbles were thrown, the ratio of the number of pebbles that fell in the circle and the number of pebbles that fell in the square approximated the ratio of the figure's respective areas. Multiplying the ratio by 4 gave Luan an estimate of Lutho's number itself. The more pebbles thrown, the more accurate the estimate. And so, from chance, Luan derived certainty. From chaos, order. From randomness, a pattern that reached evermore for meaning, perfection, and beauty. What? I'm not even trying to be funny. Y'all, that was nonsense to me. And I don't mean that it is nonsense. I mean that it is nonsense to me. I don't know what even the fuck. What, like, that just, none of that meant a word of anything to me. So apparently it's like a sign of intelligence, but also piety. Sure, okay, let's go with that. But I really don't even know what it is that he is supposed to have done here. I just don't get it. But I'm just going to leave that there because I don't need to understand that specifically. So Luan Zia would have succeeded his father as the chief augur of Han, and he would have devoted his life to numbers and figures, to calculations and theorems, to prove some mystical conjectures, to the endlessly fascinating task of approximating the elusive will of the gods. But then came Emperor Mapidere. So what winds up happening is that his father, when they get sacked, dresses up Luan in the clothes of a little girl, and dresses up a servant in the clothes of a Xana soldier, and has this servant take Luan away and pretend that he has like a captive and that he's one of the soldiers, which Luan looks back and realizes how incredibly intelligent this plan was, because he's flipping out knowing that he's leaving his family to die. And yet, the fact that he's flipping out and wants to be with his family fits completely with this disguise, because it just looks like a Xana soldier taking a child away, so nobody questions it at all. Unfortunately, some Han villagers think that they're rescuing a captured girl from a Xana brute and kill the servant. And they kill the servant and then just leave Luan, apparently. Don't take in Luan. So he wakes up and there's nobody there to take care of him, and he just has to kind of like find his way around. So that sucks. And I really feel for that servant. That blows. So finally, Luan is so consumed with his need to like take down the emperor that he begins formulating a plan to use this like kite thing. And as he's doing it, this is really something that feels so true to me in terms of like, I have a family member who puts a lot of stock in numerology and signs, like the appearance of certain birds or certain like, symbolic events, or like, choosing a page at random to read and what the page says means something to you. Like, this sort of superstition means a lot to them, to the point that I find it to be unhealthy a lot of the time. It's an effort to control things, except it's not controlling anything. It's just trying to find out the future before it happens, which does not change what the future is. And so what's the point of knowing it? Like, I just, in a lot of ways, find the idea of divination to be like ultimately useless. And why would you even try? But every day, every hour, every waking moment, he asked the same questions and sought answers in signs. What did it mean that the field of wildflowers he passed through had more Queen Naka's lace than butter and eggs? Since the former were white and the latter were yellow, the respective colors of Xana and Han, did that signify the gods favored the empire? Or perhaps the key was in the shapes of the flowers, whereas butter and eggs reminded of the curving beak of Minjin Falcon, the delicate Queen Naka's lace put one in mind of Lutho's fishing net. In that case, the gods might have meant to show their favor to Han. Or perhaps the answer was hidden within a mathematical puzzle. It was easy to calculate the area of the petals that made up the flower of the butter and eggs, but not at all clear how to determine the exact area of an umbel of Queen Naka's lace. From a common center, the stalks branched and sub-branched like blood vessels until they terminated in tiny white florets. Calculating the area of such a thing made up of more holes and edges than solid presence would be like computing the circumference of a snowflake. Yo, this guy goes a little too far out. And he just gets obsessed with this. And finally, he decides, like, he gets to this point where he's like, oh, the gods don't care. The gods don't give a shit. Like, time might pass totally differently from them. They don't give a shit who's ruling. They don't give a shit what's happening to us. Like, they don't even notice. I need to focus on the world and stop worrying about what the gods even think, because why would they even care? And I found that to be like, that's much more true to how I feel about things. Like, do I pray when I want help occasionally? Yes. But do I really in my heart believe that God is like watching everything that happens and has a grand plan? No, I really don't believe that. As much as I would like to, and as comforting as that thought is, I don't believe it. And this whole thing where he's like sort of comes to this point and realizes it. he's thinking about how the gods would continue to live for millions more years, and all generations of men in the history of Dara would be gone in the few blinks of their leathery, salty-teared eyes. The gods didn't care who died and who lived. The gods did not have a stake in the affairs of men. It was foolish to think one could divine their will. It was foolish to think his vendetta against Emperor Mapudere meant anything to them other than a balm for his aching, raging heart. Yep, best way to approach things, honestly, I think. Worrying about the gods is just pointless. And so he continues with fucking, like, trying to get this hang glider thing to work. And he, like, breaks legs and shit. Like, this is a man dedicated to his cause. He patches himself up and waits to heal and tries again. Like, this is some serious dedication. Oh, my God. So he tries. He gets really close, as we know, but fails because the men that are guarding Mapudere are braver and faster than he expected. And there's really nowhere for him to go after he fails this attempt because he's pretty recognizable. And people all would turn him in an instant if they found out who he was, because their entire family for 5 generations would be killed. So he finally decides that he is just going to take a gamble and head to a remote island that is supposed to be peopled by natives so savage that nobody has ever been able to overthrow them. And, like, the rumors are that they're, like, cannibals and the whole thing. So he is really weak, and he heads over there and washes up on the shore and wakes up, and the Aduans, who are the people who live on this island, pretty much leave him alone. And he's really surprised by this, but, like, really gratified as well. He builds his own hut. He manages to create enough, like, food for himself and hunts enough that he can offer the Aduans gifts, basically in thanks for, like, not fucking with him. And as time goes on, the kids from the village test the waters and, like, come over and visit him a little bit until finally he's able to start communicating with the little kids and learns their language, like, really slowly. And finally, the kids drag him back to the village at one point when there is a feast going on. And he is made to join in the feast. And in the morning, they make it clear that he's meant to stay. And he moves into the village and builds himself a new hut and, like, figures out how to live amongst these people. And the chief's son asks him, "Why did you hold yourself apart as though you were a stranger?" "Wasn't I? The sea is vast and the islands few and small. Before the power of the sea, all of us are helpless and naked like newborns. Anyone who drifts onto shore becomes a brother." It was odd to hear such a note of compassion from a people reputed to be savage, but by then Luanzia was finally ready to accept that he really knew nothing about the Aduans at all. So much received wisdom was not wisdom at all, just like so much of what men imagined as signs from the gods were only wishes in their heads. It was best to attend to the world of what was, rather than what he had been told. Yo, that is critical thinking skills right there. And that is the shit that we need to be teaching kids. We really do. It's like a hard thing to teach because it requires your mind to work in certain ways. And if your mind doesn't naturally work in those ways, it can feel like you're just not destined to be good at it. But you can exercise those kinds of muscles and learn how to question things more. And I just love that moment, to attend the world of what was rather than what he had been told. That just really is it, isn't it? That's just it right there. So it turns out they have a nickname for him, the long-legged crab, because that's what they thought he looked like when he came out of the sea. So he lives with him for 7 years and is really happy in a lot of ways. But the trauma that he endured and the desire for revenge never quite can go away. His nights began to be filled with dark dreams that left him drenched in sweat. Old memories surfaced and refused to sink. The sight of burning books and the voices of dying scholars seized his mind. His heart yearned for the task he thought he had left behind. The aspen wishes to stand still, his friend Kaizen said, as he saw the look in Luanzia's eyes. But the wind does not stop. So, finally, he leaves, and he doesn't have anywhere to go when he heads over to the big island. But he just decides that he's going to, try and figure out, what his destiny is. He's just sort of wandering and learning as much as he can and observing how the world has changed since he left. And it's really upsetting to him because Xana has taken over to such a degree that there are children who are not aware of their history at all, and they're celebrating things from Xana, and they are singing songs about Old Han without any connection to it or understanding of it, as if it is this mythological place. And it's just really sad to read this. The girls sang as though the songs were from another land, a mythical past with no connection to them. Their laughter showed no understanding of the ache of losing their country. Zia was lost. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. That killed me. I follow a few pages on Facebook that are Native American community pages. And it's really moving and upsetting seeing them teaching old traditions, dance or butchering of animals or things like this to kids, and knowing that I, as a child, when taught things, did not appreciate the significance of it as a kid. So they're teaching kids, and hopefully one day those children will grow up to be adults and understand the gravity of learning something that a conquering nation tried to wipe out forever, did their best to completely extinguish. And what a kind of rebellious act it is to retain that and continue to teach it. But it is hard to see these children who are just, they're enjoying their day in the sun, learning how to do something at a very surface level, and just don't understand the pain behind it for the people teaching it to them, and the memory and the shared trauma that one day they will understand is there. And it's so upsetting to know how many peoples in the world have experienced this very kind of thing due to colonization. And it's just really, it's hard to read, man. I got kind of choked up over this, to be honest. So this is when he encounters his teacher, which I have no shame in saying I would have told this motherfucker to fuck right off. Okay, I'll read you this. And of course, I'm assuming that this is going to be a Yoda type. It turns out that this is a god, pretty much. So he sees this old man fishing. He walks by, and the old man's shoes fall off his feet and splash into the sea. "Stop," the old man said to him. "Get down there and pick them up." There was no please, no would you, no could I ask you a favor. Luan Zia, still a son of the noble Zia clan, bristled at the old man's tone, but he forced himself to relax and dove into the water, retrieving the old man's dirty, ragged shoes. As he climbed onto the pier, the old man said, "Put them on my feet." His hazel eyes were impassive, staring out of a wrinkled face whose color was even blacker than Luan's own. There was no "thank you," no "I'm grateful," no "sorry, but could you—" Luan was now curious rather than angry. He knelt down, still dripping with seawater, and put the shoes back on the old man's feet. The skin on his feet was calloused and full of cracks, Luan saw, and reminded Luan of the leathery skin of a turtle. First clue. "You are not so arrogant as to be unteachable," the old fisherman said. He smiled and revealed 2 rows of crooked yellow teeth full of holes. Yikes. "Come here first thing tomorrow morning and I might have something for you." So he comes the next morning, but the teacher's already there. And the teacher says, "You're the youngster and I'm the old one and I'm the teacher and you're the student, and yet you showed up after me? Come back in a week and you do better than that." So Luan comes back really, really early, at dawn, but the teacher's still there before him. You have to try harder. One last chance. After another week, Luan decided to camp out at the pier the night before. He brought a blanket, but the chill night air from the sea made it impossible to sleep. He sat shivering under the blanket and again thought he ought to be put in a madhouse. The old man showed up 2 hours before sunrise. "You made it," he said. "But why? Why are you here?" And Luan says, "Because I don't know what I don't know." And the old man nods and gives him a book. And this book is serious. It's filled with letters and numbers, page after page, really thin pages of practical knowledge, equations and diagrams for ingenious machines and new ways to understand the workings of the world. Many of them elucidations and amplifications of ideas that he'd already been aware of, but only dimly. Understanding nature is as close as men can get to understanding the gods, the old man said. Luan tried to read a few pages and was overwhelmed by both the text's density and its elegance. He could spend a lifetime studying these pages. Continuing to flip through, he saw the second half of the book was blank. He looked at the old man in confusion. The old fisherman smiled and mouthed, "Watch." Luan looked down and was astonished to see the figures and words appearing on the formerly blank pages. Logograms rose out of the paper as indistinct blobs, but gradually gained sharp edges, smooth faces, and intricate details. They seemed solid enough, but when Luan tried to touch them, his fingers only moved through airy phantasms. The Zindari letters wriggled onto the page as faint traces, milled about and danced, and settled into tight, beautiful formations. Drawings began as blurred black and white outlines and slowly became filled with vibrant colors. I love this. It's such a cool idea. The teacher tells him the book grows as you grow. The more you learn, the more there is to learn. It's an aid to your mind, an extension of your capacity for seeing order in chaos, for intervention. You shall never exhaust its knowledge, for it is replenished by your curiosity, and when the time is right, it will show you what you already know, but daren't yet think. Yo, that's the coolest shit I've ever seen. As a Ravenclaw, that appeals deeply to my soul. That is the raddest shit I've ever heard. And then he says, if you should succeed in your task, your true task, not that which you now think is your task, meet me in the small courtyard behind the great temple to Lutho in Jinpen. And then tells him, we care more than you know, and disappears. The gods care more than he knows. I still stand by it. It's better to operate like the gods don't care. I think that's a smarter way to live. But that's pretty fucking rad. I love it. So Luan travels and writes in this thing and learns things and tracks it all. And even though he doesn't know what he's really like preparing for, he is sure that all of this is going to be coming in handy for him at some point. I'm just realizing Kyle said, I was shook when you absolutely called this guy showing up again in like the first chapter. Oh yeah, bro. You know, I figured like there's certain ways that things go. I just figured he had to. But I mean, I won't say that I was like ready for him when he showed up. Like I was still like, oh shit, no way. So chapter 19, Luanzia has told this whole story to Kuni. And he and Kuni get along really well. And Kuni is like, man, you came so close. It's really too bad. And Luan says, if I had succeeded, it wouldn't even have done any good. And Kuni is like, what do you mean? And he says, Mapidere had set something in motion, and his death would not have stopped it. The empire had taken on a life of its own. Killing the empire would not have been enough. We have to kill the empire. I'm like, yep, that's true though. He's not wrong. It's time to bring Han back and carve up the carcass of the empire. I'm on my way to Karuza now to offer my services to King Kosugi. Which, I wish he would just go to fucking Thero, but okay. So yeah, the whole thing is or theory? Is it theory? Kuni then says that he's not so sure that Krima and Shigin were like better for the people, and that there has to be a better choice than just those two shitty ones, which, like, two-party system much? What's up? Luanzia appraised this strange young man. He had never met a rebel who so openly questioned their cause, and yet he found himself liking Kuni Guru. I think the rebellion is only the beginning. It's like the start of a deer hunt. Many are in the field, brandishing their bows and spears, but as for who will bring down the stag, there's no way yet to know. How the hunt will end up is up to all of us. So yeah, they become really good friends, but they have to part ways pretty quickly. And Kuni is just like, man, you really have like opened my eyes to just how much is out there that I don't know about. And Luan tells him that he thinks that Kuni is a sleeping Kruben about to wake. Is that a prophecy? I'd call it a hunch. Kuni laughed. It's too bad you aren't saying this in front of my relations and friends. A lot of them still don't think I'll amount to much. But no, I don't think I want to be a Kruben. I'd rather be a dandelion seed. Luan was startled for a moment, but then slowly broke into a smile. Forgive me, Lord Guru. I should have known better than to speak in a way that could be mistaken for flattery. You may not be born noble, but you have a noble mind. Which is just like, they're just so cute. You know, I just like the fact that they like get along. I like friends. Thufi, that's the one. So King Thufi is not impressed with Kuni. Not shocked by that. But it is so funny. He's like, all right, this guy, first of all, does not look like a fucking duke. He looks like a gangster. Secondly, Zudi is nowhere. I don't even know what that is. Third of all, once I introduced him like a duke, he just reveals that he doesn't have anything to offer. He has no land. He has no people. And now you're asking a favor. Fucking really. Oh my God. Like, he just can't get over this guy's fucking gall. Which, again, I think Kuni is the best, but the king is not wrong either, at all. It's just, it works, you know? Matters concerning military strategy must be discussed with Marshal Zindu, King Thufi said. He wanted to get this character out of his sight as soon as possible. So he busts in on an argument between Phin and Mata, which it turns out is directly related to what Kuni is going to ask him to do. Who is this Duke of Zudi? Have you ever heard of the fief? Phin asked Mata, and Mata shrugged. Kuni came in and immediately sucked in his breath. Standing in the middle of the tent was the most amazing specimen of a human being he had ever seen. Mata Zindu was over 8 feet tall, and each of his arms seemed as thick as both of Kuni's thighs put together. And Kuni wasn't exactly slender, to put it mildly. I love that. So Kuni, keeps his face on and acts like this doesn't faze him at all, and shakes both of their hands and makes eye contact with Mata, which most people can't do because they don't know which of his pupils to focus on because he has 2 irises. So he decides to focus on the middle 2 and just goes with it and talks to him like a fucking person. And Mata is sort of taken with him. He likes the fact that Kuni doesn't appear intimidated. He likes that he makes eye contact with him. And even though Kuni sits down in the familiar Guepa style, which is not really appropriate for people that you're just meeting who are kind of your superiors, it doesn't bother them. They're both like, well, all right. And they both get into the Guepa position as well. And it says there was a warmth and enthusiasm radiating from Kuni that made Mata feel an instinctive respect for the man, even though he didn't behave at all like a noble. Kuni quickly explained what he came for and his plan for making a stand at Zudi. Mata Zindu and Phin Zindu glanced at each other and both burst out laughing. Duke Karoo, you won't believe this, Zindu said after he recovered. Right before you came in, my nephew had been debating military strategy with me. My view was, and remains, that we should stay on this side of the Porin Plains, fortify our positions, and wait for Namen to come to us. We should be prepared to give up all the cities in North Kakru, and by the time Namen reaches us, his supply lines will be overextended and his men exhausted, and we'll have a better chance of crushing him. My view is just the opposite, Mata said. I think we should strike Namen right now. So far, he's met no meaningful resistance. That fool Krima had no idea what he was doing. He will be arrogant and his men overconfident. If Uncle Phin and I take a company of our best troops and go meet Namen head-on at one of the cities on the plains, we'll be able to defeat him before he even gets far into Kakru. The victory will give a much-needed boost to the confidence of the other rebels after the death of King Jizu. So, the fact that Kuni is here asking for this basically sways Phin to the point where he's like, all right, clearly this is what we're going to do then. But he talks like very plainly about, listen, we'll give you 5,000 men, but if you fail, you're going to really have fucked us up. Like, we can't really spare these 5,000 and we're putting a lot of trust in you giving it to you. And Kuni says, all life is a great game. In war, there are no certainties. If you aren't willing to gamble, you'll never win. Mata Zindu nodded. Kuni said exactly what was on his mind. And I love what Kuni says next. But there is a moral dimension as well. If you cede all of North Kakru to Namen, the people of all the cities of Porin Plains will suffer greatly under Xana reoccupation for having supported Krima and Shigin and King Thufi. If we abandon the people for the cold calculus of abstract strategy, we'll chill the people's hearts. They rose up under the banner of Krima and Shigin, and then of King Thufi, because of the promise that life will be better without the Empire. Some of us have worked hard to make that vision come true, and I think we should try to do what we can to stop Namen from ripping that dream to shreds. So, he's correct. Like, just abandoning everybody just because you think that's a better strategy, that's gonna fuck up their heads and make them, like, not feel like they're the new country that they thought they were going to be getting, or the old country they'd be getting back, gives any shits about them any more than Xana cares about them. So I really like that. Phin thought over the situation. He had been worried that Mata was too hot-blooded to be given his own command, but this Kuni Guru seemed to have good sense and would compliment Mata's courage and battlefield prowess. What have I been saying, though? Seriously. So he agrees to do that and continue training and building forces while the two of them are away. Gia, who is hugely pregnant by this point, has decided to stay behind. And I'm rooting for her, and I hope things are cool with her. So they go back to Zudi, and they're able to get there much quicker than Kuni was able to get to Thufi. And I love that Thon, who is the guy who was in charge of the horses and had been bothering Kuni about how they needed more horses all the time, is so fucking dumbstruck by Mata's horse. And he's like, Kuni is talking to him and he's not paying any attention because he's staring at this fucking monster of a horse that he can't believe actually exists. So they get to Zudi and they arrest Lieutenant Doza, and like everybody inside is like, well, we were here to like capitulate to Namen, but Namen's nowhere to be seen, and here we've got 5,000 people right outside our walls. So I guess we're just gonna take back what we said, and you can come back in, Kuni. And Mata comes in with his fucking 8-foot tall self in chain link armor, and he sees Doza and is like, okay, so I figure we'll draw and quarter this guy. That sound good? Which I'm just like, oh god, that's so horrible. Kuni says, General Zindu, would you give me the pleasure of dealing with this man? Of course, Mata said. He insulted you. It's only proper you decide his punishment. Kuni got off his horse and walked to the tied-up man. You really thought that we had no chance against Namen? Why ask a question whose answer you already know? Doza's voice was bitter. And you figured that there was no point in wasting soldiers and people's lives. Doza nodded wearily. You didn't have much confidence in my ability to defend Zudi. Doza laughed. You're nothing but a bandit and a gangster. You don't know the first thing about fighting a war. There was no point in lying. He might as well let this idiot know what he really thought. I can see your point. If I were in your position, I might have done the same. Kuni knelt down and untied Dosa. Since you were trying to save the lives of the people of Zudi, including the lives of my parents, brothers, and in-laws, according to the teachings of Kon Fiji, it would be wrong for me to punish you harshly, even if you did betray me. But I assure you that will beat Old Man Naaman and his imperial thugs. As for your punishment, I'm leaving you in charge of the men who had followed you, so that you can now teach them faith and courage. Dosa could hardly believe his ears. He looked at his freed arms. After a moment, he knelt before Kuni-Garu and touched his forehead to the ground. Mata Zindu frowned. This was surely a mistake. The Duke of Zudi seemed to have a woman's mercy and little sense of discipline. To be so lenient to a traitor would only invite more betrayals in the future. But since he had already said that the man's fate was up to Kuni, he couldn't intervene. He shook his head and decided not to worry about it for now. There was still much to be done. Namen's forces would arrive at any moment. So this basically begins the whole, a whole jaunt of Kuni having to go around Zudi and release people from prison who had gone to prison for continuing to be loyal to him, and telling people that he's back. His parents are very mad at him and throw their shoes at him, which I found amazing. And I love that Mata is so baffled by that, because he's like, you became a duke. They're not impressed by that. And Kuni's like, dude, parents, they want their kids to be successful, but mostly they just want their kids to be safe. And what I'm doing is the opposite of safe, and also putting their lives at risk. So no, they're not impressed. I'm trying to find the next. Oh, here it is. He goes to the prison, where Otho, the sweet guy who was super loyal to Kuni, but also low key in love with Gia. He is in prison, and Kuni lets him out, and tells him, I'm ashamed that you've suffered so much. He lets out a bunch of other people as well. I vow today I will never consider this debt I owe you repaid until I have brought you, my brothers, all the riches and honor that you deserve. To which they reply, Lord Guru, do not speak this way. We cannot bear it. We will follow you to the top of Mount Kiji in the bottom of the Tazu whirlpool. We're blessed by the gods to have a generous lord like you, Lord Guru. Mata frowned at this breach in etiquette. He could not understand how a superior like Kuni could bow to a servant like Otho Kryn, and how these lowly peasants were speaking in such foolish ways. Meanwhile, Kogo is watching this and is really impressed, and I love the assessment here. He was still amazed at how Kuni's sincerity shaded into an instinct for political theater. He was, of course, moved by the loyalty of a man who would rather be in jail than betray him, but he also knew how to play it for all it was worth to cement even more loyalty. Seriously, that is wily. I like it. I love it. Kuni's so great. So Otho's really sad that Gia's not here. Kuni doesn't seem to really get exactly how in love with her Otho is, but that's all right. So Kuni and Mata send out word that anybody left over from the Krima Shigin forces are welcome to join them at Kokru. And gradually more and more begin to show up until eventually they have 8,000 instead of 5, which is pretty awesome. DeFiro and Rat, meanwhile, managed to survive everything. The rout of Naaman, and pretended to be dead bodies so that they could hide on a cart full of corpses. And DeFiro sort of is can we just stop with fucking being soldiers entirely and just go up into the hills and be bandits and have done? Because I'm really tired of fighting for these fucking nobles who don't give any shits about us. But Rat is Mom would really hate to see us become bandits. I'm doing all of this out of loyalty to her and wanting to get revenge on Xana for sending her down basically down the toilet, and I'm not going to do something that would dishonor her while I'm trying to get my revenge. And DeFiro finally agrees. He thought his brother very foolish, but also very brave. He wished he were as brave. Let's go join the Duke of Zudu and General Zindu. Or the Duke of Zudi and General Zindu. Hey, didn't we see General Zindu once? I know, he was that mystery rider at King Huno's coronation. The one who made fun of the king and called him a monkey. Now that is a lord worth fighting for, said Rotho. He was afraid of nothing, and then the king's men tried to shoot him, and Fithaweo himself stepped in. Don't repeat foolish superstitions, said DeFiro. The admiring tone in Rotho's voice made him feel a twinge of sorrow. Rotho had always only spoken that way about their father, or DeFiro. Maybe Rotho was finally growing up, and maybe he was going to get his own heroes. So DeFiro says, I hear they're fair, and that they pay their men on time. At least we'll be fed, and maybe we'll even get to see Emperor Irishi someday. But if anything goes wrong, you and I are running away. Only fools would die for those nobles. They wouldn't even blink if they could get a copper piece for our lives, so we have to watch out for ourselves. You hear me? And that is the end of chapter 19. And I heartily agree with DeFiro's assessment. Like, honestly, there really does come a point where it's like, I want to fight for what's right, but also recognize that I am a pawn in the war of rich men and maybe don't matter. So, yeah. So that's the end of that chapter. So I'm going to go again. I'm going to be starting the next one at 4 instead of at 3. So just keep an eye on that, everybody. And thank you again to Kyle for commissioning this. This has been super fun to read. I don't know what's going to happen next at this point, because now that Mata and Kuni are like paired up, which happened much sooner than I ever expected, anything can happen. I really don't know. So we'll see. But thank you all again for listening. I hope that you guys have been enjoying my coverage, and I will be seeing you soon, hopefully, with a new episode. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.